In the dry desert caves of southern Oregon, a team of archaeologists pulled something out of the dirt that broke a century of scientific consensus in a single afternoon. They sent it to the lab. The result came back wrong. So wrong they assumed the machine had failed. So they ran it again, then a third time. Every single result pointed to the same answer. Human beings were standing on American soil thousands of years before history says any human being was here. And what Oregon revealed next did not just rewrite the story of who first came to America, it burned the entire textbook to the ground. There's a row of dry rock shelters carved into a hillside in south central Oregon, sitting above what used to be the shoreline of an ancient lake. The lake dried up thousands of years ago. The caves stayed. Locals knew about them. Historians knew about them. And for decades, archaeologists knew about them too, and mostly left them alone, because the question of who first came to America was already supposed to be answered. The textbook had spoken, the museum halls were arranged, the debate was over, so why dig deeper in a dusty cave in the middle of the Oregon high desert when you already knew what you were going to find? The answer, it turned out, was because nobody actually knew. And the Paisley Caves, that is what this place is called, the Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves, located in the Summer Lake Basin, roughly 220 miles southeast of Eugene, were about to prove it in the most uncomfortable way imaginable, not with a dramatic weapon or a golden artifact or the skeleton of some ancient warrior, with something far humbler, far older, and far more scientifically powerful than any of those things. With the most ordinary thing a human body leaves behind. The Paisley Caves are located in the Summer Lake Basin near Paisley, about 220 miles southeast of Eugene on the eastern side of the Cascade Range. The series of 8 caves are westward-facing, wave-cut shelters on the highest shoreline of pluvial Lake Chewaucan, which rose and fell in periods of greater precipitation during the Pleistocene. What makes them remarkable is not their appearance. From the outside, they look like every other rock shelter in the Oregon high desert, a series of shallow overhangs and dry stone, unremarkable, sun-baked, silent. What makes them remarkable is what the dry desert air preserved inside them for thousands of years, while everything else on the planet rotted away to nothing. The University of Oregon team that excavated these caves, led by senior archaeologist Dennis Jenkins, did not go in expecting a revolution. They went in to evaluate earlier claims about human megafauna coexistence and to assess the condition of the deposits. They peeled back the cave floor one careful layer at a time, recording what was there, going deeper than anyone had gone before. And at a depth that the official timeline said no human artifact had any right to exist, they found preserved human waste, coprolites dried and hardened over thousands of years, sitting exactly where a person left them on an ordinary day in a world we can barely imagine. The find itself was humble enough to be dismissed. Dried organic material in a cave could be anything. The scientific establishment had dismissed stranger things before and would again. But this was not just organic material. This was organic material that could be tested directly, dated independently, and analyzed at the molecular level in ways that previous archaeological evidence simply could not support. Researchers established that humans were present at Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves by 12,300 radiocarbon years before the present, through the recovery of human mitochondrial DNA from coprolites directly dated by accelerator mass spectrometry. The mtDNA corresponds to Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. The dates of the coprolites are more than 1,000 radiocarbon years earlier than currently accepted dates for the Clovis complex. Read that last sentence carefully. More than 1,000 years earlier. Not a few centuries of ambiguity, not a marginal overlap that could be explained away with measurement error. A full 1,000 years and more before the people who were supposed to be first even showed up on the continent. And the DNA that came out of that material was not some ambiguous signal. It matched haplogroups A2 and B2, the founding lineages of Native American populations that are alive today. Not a dead branch, not a failed migration that wandered in and died out. The direct genetic ancestors of indigenous people walking around on this continent right now. The Paisley Caves in Oregon record the oldest directly dated human remains in the form of DNA in the Western Hemisphere. More than 100 high-precision radiocarbon dates show that deposits containing artifacts and coprolites ranging in age from 12,450 to 2,095 radiocarbon years ago are well stratified. There is no evidence of diagnostic Clovis technology at the site. That last detail is the one that the mainstream archaeology establishment found most difficult to absorb. No Clovis technology. The tools found at the Paisley Caves belong to what researchers call the Western STEM tradition, a completely different approach to shaping stone, with long blades, rounded bases, and weak shoulders that look nothing like the distinctive fluted points that defined Clovis culture. These two distinct technologies were parallel developments, not the product of a unilinear technological evolution. The colonization of the Americas involved multiple technologically divergent, and possibly genetically divergent, founding groups. This was not a refinement of the existing story. This was a completely different story. Multiple groups, multiple technologies, multiple arrivals, and the people at Paisley Caves, more than 14,000 years ago, had nothing to do with the Clovis hunters that every museum had placed at the front of the American story. One site produces one date, and the old guard can wave it away. Science has survived single anomalous results before. The critics have a whole arsenal of objections ready. Contamination, mixed layers, sample error, bad luck. Any one result, no matter how careful the methodology, can be dismissed by a sufficiently motivated establishment. What the establishment cannot dismiss so easily is a pattern. And 70 miles from Paisley Caves, the pattern was about to get a great deal harder to ignore. The University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History Archaeological Field School, led by archaeologist Patrick O'Grady, has been excavating at the Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter since 2011 under an official partnership agreement with the Bureau of Land Management. Discoveries at the site have included stone tools and extinct mammal tooth fragments from the Pleistocene epoch. The pieces of tooth enamel are identified as bison and camel. Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter sits near the eastern Oregon town of Riley in Harney County. It is not a dramatic place. It is a basalt overhang about 3 meters deep and 20 meters long, sitting above an ancient stream channel in the Oregon high desert. O'Grady's team dug there year after year, season after season, with no guarantee that any of it would amount to anything. Archaeology at this scale is not the dramatic discovery of popular imagination. It is knees in the dirt, brush and screen, careful documentation, and the patience to wait for the evidence to speak on its own terms. What it handed them in the end was not a date. It handed them a clock. Buried in the soil was something that no laboratory test could contaminate and no critic could dismiss, a layer of white volcanic ash from a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens. In 2012, O'Grady's team found camel teeth fragments under a layer of volcanic ash from an eruption of Mount St. Helens that was dated over 15,000 years ago. The team also uncovered 2 finely crafted orange agate scrapers, one in 2012 with preserved bison blood residue, and another in 2015 buried deeper in the ash. A volcanic ash layer is not a sample you run through a machine and hope the result comes back clean. It is a geological event. A volcano erupted, its ash drifted across the landscape, and everything beneath that ash was sealed under a lid of time that nobody can argue with. The identification of 15,000-year-old volcanic ash was a shock. Then the 18,000-year-old dates on the enamel with stone tools and flakes below were even more startling. O'Grady said, "It's not so much that we have such old dates, but that we're getting consistent results." Unpublished dates ranging from approximately 18,000 to 17,000 calibrated years before present were identified by Dr. Thomas Stafford Jr. and Dr. John Southen. In 2017, further orange agate and chalcedony debitage was found along with bison carpal and teeth fragments and obsidian flakes, all suggesting pre-Clovis occupation. As of 2024, presentations by O'Grady have reaffirmed the evidence for 18,000-year-old occupation without reporting new excavations. Among the artifacts pulled from below the volcanic ash at Rimrock Draw was an object that carries its own quiet authority. An orange chalcedony scraper, a glassy stone worked into a single implement with multiple functional edges, worn smooth by years of use. Not the kind of smoothness that comes from lying in the ground for 18,000 years. The kind of smoothness that comes from a human hand carrying the same tool every single day for years, using it to cut and scrape and saw until the edge is polished down to a surface that still reflects the life of the person who used it. The archaeobotanists studying plant remains from the site found evidence of cooking fires. The zoo archaeologists confirmed the presence of extinct Ice Age animals, and the geologists confirmed what the tool placement already suggested, that the scraper did not belong to the same moment as the volcanic ash above it. It was older, significantly older, and the animals it was found near, the Ice Age camel, the extinct giant bison, were animals that had not walked the Oregon high desert for thousands of years by the time anyone had previously supposed a human being was anywhere near this continent. The Rimrock Draw findings could mean that people lived in Oregon over 3,000 years before the Bering Land Bridge opened up. This means that the Bering Strait might not have been the first method by which humans entered the Americas. They might have entered earlier, raising new questions from archaeologists and historical scientists about how people might have entered North America earlier than 18,000 years ago. Oregon had cracked the timeline wide open. But what happened next? Across the country in a field of pale white gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico, transformed a crack into a chasm. White Sands National Park, with its rolling, bleached landscape that barely looks like it belongs on this planet, had been hiding something in the dried bed of an ancient lake called Lake Otero. Shapes pressed into the gypsum, dozens of them. Unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Human footprints, 61 of them. You can see the toes, you can see the arch. Some are tiny, the size of a child's foot. Others belong to adults moving at speed. Not abstract evidence, not a chemical signature in a sample jar, not a groove in a rock. The actual physical record of human beings walking along the edge of an ice age lake on an ordinary day, pressing their feet into soft mud that the sun baked hard and sediment buried and preserved in the dark for longer than anyone thought possible. In September 2021, USGS researchers and an international team of scientists announced that ancient human footprints discovered in White Sands National Park were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. This discovery pushed the known date of human presence in North America back by thousands of years and implied that early inhabitants and megafauna coexisted for several millennia before the terminal Pleistocene extinction event. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some researchers accepted the evidence. Others attacked the dating methodology, arguing that the seeds used for radiocarbon dating from an aquatic plant called spiral ditch grass might have absorbed old carbon from groundwater, making them appear older than they actually were. It was a legitimate scientific objection. And the team answered it the only way science can be answered, with more evidence. University of Arizona researcher Vance Holliday and colleagues radiocarbon dated mud cores from the site and found that the trackways date to between 20,700 and 22,400 years ago, which closely matches the original dates. When added together, there are now a total of 55 radiocarbon dated samples of mud, seeds, and pollen from the footprint layer that support the 21,000 to 23,000 year dates. A newly published study in Science Advances in June 2025 provides the strongest evidence to date that ancient human tracks found at White Sands National Park are approximately 23,000 years old. With multiple dating methods and separate lab confirmations now supporting the timeline, the White Sands footprints offer compelling evidence that humans came to the Americas far earlier than had been believed. 3 independent materials, 3 independent testing approaches, 55 separate radiocarbon dated samples, all pointing to the same moment in time. The height of the last glacial maximum, when the official story insists that the continent was sealed off, uninhabited, waiting for people who had not yet arrived. The footprints say otherwise. The children walking along that ancient lakeshore say otherwise. And the mammoth and giant ground sloth tracks running alongside those human footprints, the tracks of animals that had been extinct for thousands of years by the time Clovis hunters supposedly first set foot on the continent, say otherwise in terms that require no translation. If Oregon cracked the timeline and White Sands confirmed the crack, what happened in the suburbs of San Diego did something different. It did not crack the timeline. It detonated it. And it did so in the most unglamorous possible setting, a highway construction project in Southern California, on a routine afternoon when a piece of earth-moving equipment hit something in the ground that was not a rock. The Kurudi Mastodon site was discovered by San Diego Natural History Museum researchers in November 1992 during routine paleontological mitigation work. The site preserves hammerstones, stone anvils, and fragmentary remains, bones, tusks, and molars, of a mastodon that show evidence of modification by early humans. The California Department of Transportation requires paleontologists to be on call at major excavations. Field paleontologist Richard Cerruti was that person on that day, and what he flagged for follow-up would eventually become the most controversial archaeological site in North America. The team blocked off the area and excavated carefully, working down to material undisturbed by the machinery. What they found, piece by piece, as the dirt came away, was not just a fossil. It was a scene. Something had been done to these bones on purpose. The Kurudi Mastodon site contains spiral fractured bone and molar fragments, indicating that breakage occurred while fresh. Several of these fragments also preserve evidence of percussion. 5 large cobbles displaying use wear and impact marks are hydraulically anomalous relative to the low-energy context of the enclosing sandy silt stratum, meaning water could not have carried them there. The uranium-thorium radiometric analysis of multiple bone specimens indicates a burial date of 130,700 plus or minus 9,400 years ago. Spiral fractures only happen to fresh bone. When bone dries out and fossilizes, it becomes brittle. Hit it, and it shatters. But fresh bone that still has moisture and marrow inside, twists and spirals as it breaks, exactly the way a green branch twists when you snap it. These were not bones that fossilized and then broke. These were bones that were broken while they were still fresh. And the 5 large cobblestones found among them, stones too heavy for water to have carried into the position where they were found, were not random. They showed use wear, impact marks. They were tools, hammerstones and anvils, carried to a site by someone who understood exactly how to break a mastodon femur open to get at the marrow inside. To bolster their theory, researchers analyzed mastodon bones found in later North American sites, which date from 14,000 to 33,000 years ago. These bones displayed the same fracture patterns that were observed among the remains of the Cerruti mastodon. Researchers also tried to replicate the activity that may have occurred at the site by striking the bones of a recently deceased elephant, and produced exactly the same kinds of fracture patterns seen on the Karuti mastodon limb bones. The site's central claim is evidence of human activity approximately 13700 years ago, far earlier than previously accepted timelines. The Karuti findings suggest human activity over 115,000 years earlier than the established Clovis timeline. While the Clovis first model has been challenged by other pre-Clovis sites dating back 14,000 to 15,000 years ago, the Karuti site pushes this timeline back by an order of magnitude, 130,700 years. That number requires a moment to sit with. The oldest sites we have discussed so far, Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, White Sands, are remarkable precisely because they push human presence in North America back to 14,000, 18,000, 23,000 years ago. The Karuti mastodon site is more than 5 times older than any of those. It is older than the widely accepted date for modern humans, spreading out of Africa. It is, if the evidence holds, evidence of an entirely unknown hominin species, something from the genus Homo that science has not named, has not found anywhere else in the Americas, and has no current model to explain, cracking open a mastodon bone for its marrow in what is now Southern California more than 100,000 years before anyone thought a human being set foot on this continent. And once you accept that the evidence from Oregon, New Mexico, and California forces a reckoning with a timeline far older than anything in the standard model, a different question becomes unavoidable. The old answer, a single land bridge crossing from Siberia around 13,000 years ago, was already straining under the weight of pre-Clovis evidence. Sites like Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw showed people in Oregon before that land bridge crossing was even theoretically possible. White Sands showed families with children at the height of the last glacial maximum. The Karuti site operates in a time frame so remote that Beringia as an explanation becomes not just insufficient, but irrelevant. So the question becomes, how? And the answer that the genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly points to is not one route and not one time. It is multiple routes, multiple times, and at least some of those arrivals came not over land at all, but across the water. Analysis of the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, D4H, traced its origin to the northern coast of China. Researchers found that the northern coast of China played a critical role in the divergence and spread of D4H and its subhaplogroups. A small number of groups further dispersed from northern China into different regions, with some dispersing into Japan and even outside East Asia into the Americas. The distribution of the rare founding mitochondrial haplogroup D4H3A along the Pacific coast of North and South America suggests that a distinct migration along the coastal route occurred, separate from and independent of the migration through the ice-free corridor. This coastal lineage shows a pattern of movement that follows the Pacific shoreline rather than the interior land routes that the traditional model assumed. The picture that emerges from this genetic evidence is of people hugging coastlines, following fish and shellfish and tides, moving camp by camp along the edge of a continent. Not a single heroic ocean crossing. Not a desperate survival march across frozen tundra. A slow, patient drift along the coast, one generation traveling a little further than the last, over a span of time that makes any individual migration invisible. The children of one camp growing up to paddle further than their parents ever did. The sea not as a barrier, but as a highway, followed by people who had learned, long before anyone supposed they could, to navigate it. Understanding why this evidence took so long to be accepted requires understanding what it was up against. The Clovis first model was not just a scientific theory. By the time researchers began seriously challenging it, it had become an institution. Careers were built on it. Museum halls were arranged around it. Textbooks taught it to generations of students as settled fact. And the people who built those careers and arranged those halls were not going to accept being told they had spent their lives defending a fairy tale without a fight. Patrick O'Grady, the archaeologist who led the Rimrock Draw excavations, described their resistance directly. There's a lot of people who don't want to believe that there's anything older than Clovis, and it's something that's pervasive in archaeology. There's just a lot of people that won't accept the new data. How do you argue with that? You really can't. The pattern of resistance is consistent across every pre-Clovis site. At Paisley Caves, critics attacked the DNA methodology and raised concerns about contamination. At Rimrock Draw, the dates were described as too extraordinary to accept without extraordinary proof. At White Sands, the initial dating was challenged on the grounds of possible old carbon contamination in the aquatic plant seeds. At the Karuti mastodon site, the response from much of the field was simply silence, a refusal to engage with evidence that was too radical, too challenging, too costly to too many established positions to be worth taking seriously. The Paisley Caves contain evidence for pre-Clovis occupation in the form of coprolites, dating to 12,400 radiocarbon years. before present. Currently, 285 radiocarbon dates have been obtained from Paisley Caves, and DNA analysis has been completed on 65 coprolites. Despite these results, questions over the reliance on DNA methods were raised, which is why researchers moved to fecal lipid biomarkers, a method with substantial advantages over DNA in that the lipids are hydrophobic and therefore unlikely to move within the stratigraphy, are highly recalcitrant over archaeological timescales, and are highly diagnostic of fecal material in its producer. The scientists doing this work responded to every challenge the same way, with more evidence, more rigor, more independent testing. The DNA was challenged, so they tested lipid biomarkers. The seed dates were challenged, so they tested conifer pollen and then ancient mud. The bone fractures were challenged, so they replicated them experimentally and compared them with fracture patterns from other sites. At every step, the evidence held. At every step, the picture it painted remained the same. Science does not move in dramatic leaps. It moves in the slow accumulation of evidence, each new study adding another layer of confirmation or another line of independent verification. And in June 2025, that accumulation reached a moment that is difficult to dismiss, even for the most committed skeptics of pre-Clovis occupation. Human footprints found in the ancient lake beds of White Sands prove that humans lived in North America 23,000 years ago, much earlier than previously believed. A new study using radiocarbon-dated mud bolsters earlier findings, making it the third line of evidence pointing to this revised timeline. 3 completely independent materials, aquatic plant seeds, conifer pollen, and ancient lakebed mud, tested at different times by different teams using different methodologies, all landing in the same window of time. 55 separate radiocarbon dates supporting a single conclusion. The footprints at White Sands are real. The people who made them were real. They were here 23,000 years ago. And the Columbian mammoth tracks and giant ground sloth tracks in the same ancient mud, walking the same ancient shoreline, prove that those families were sharing a continent with creatures that the official story says no human being ever saw. When you place this 2025 confirmation alongside the Oregon evidence, 285 radiocarbon dates from Paisley Caves, the reaffirmed 18,000-year occupation at Rimrock Draw as recently as 2024, what you have is not a collection of anomalous results that the field is still debating. You have a consistent pattern across multiple sites, multiple states, multiple methodologies, and multiple independent research teams, all pointing in the same direction. The story of the first Americans is far older, far more complex, and far more extraordinary than anything the textbook ever admitted. The Oregon caves gave the field its most solid early foundation. Human DNA, directly dated, matching living Native American lineages, with no Clovis technology in sight. Rimrock Draw gave the field a geological clock that no laboratory contamination could affect, sealed under 15,000-year-old volcanic ash, with extinct Ice Age animals and worn stone tools sitting in the same ancient dirt. White Sands gave the field something no abstract evidence can match, the physical imprint of human feet, children's feet, in mud pressed hard by Ice Age families on an ordinary afternoon 23,000 years ago. And the Karuti Mastodon site, still controversial, still largely avoided by a field that finds it too costly to engage with, sits in the background of all of it and asks a question that grows louder with every pre-Clovis confirmation. What if it goes back even further? The continent was not empty when the Clovis hunters arrived. It was already home. The genetic evidence points to people moving along the Pacific coast from northern China, following shellfish and tides, long before any ice-free corridor opened through the interior. The archaeological evidence at Oregon's 2 pre-Clovis sites points to tools that look nothing like Clovis, a separate tradition, a separate people, a separate story running in parallel beneath the official narrative for decades, while the field refused to look at it. The colonization of the Americas involved multiple technologically divergent and possibly genetically divergent founding groups. The Western STEM tradition is the oldest non-fluted lithic technology in the American Far West, and sites like Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw provide evidence that this technology predates Clovis, establishing it as the oldest well-defined technological tradition in North America, with links to late Pleistocene sites in East Asia and Siberia. That last detail closes the loop. The tools at Oregon's pre-Clovis sites do not just predate Clovis, they connect back across the Pacific to East Asia and Siberia. The same stonework logic, the same approach to shaping a blade, showing up on both sides of an ocean in the same ancient time frame. Tools do not invent themselves the same way twice in places thousands of miles apart. That is a trail. That is the physical record of people carrying their knowledge across water, camp by camp, generation by generation, until one day a group of them made camp in the caves above an ancient Oregon lake and stayed long enough to leave behind the most ordinary thing a human body produces, and the most extraordinary evidence modern archaeology has ever been forced to confront. The The Kurudi mastodon site, published in Nature in 2017, describes an unidentified species of Homo at a confirmed date of 130,700 years ago in Southern California. Most of the archaeological establishment has not formally disproven it. They have not found an alternative explanation for the spiral fractures, for the hammerstones, for the anvils sitting in sediment that water could not have placed them in. Today, the Kurudi mastodon site remains one of the most controversial archaeological digs in the world. For years, scientists have been going back and forth over the results and whether or not they indicate the presence of humans in North America 130,000 years ago. But the original authors are not giving up. The silence itself is data. When a finding is wrong, science disproves it. When a finding is inconvenient, science ignores it. And the silence around Kurudi, combined with the accumulating weight of confirmation coming out of Oregon and New Mexico, tells a story about the limits of institutional courage in the face of evidence that threatens too many established positions at once. But the evidence does not care about institutional courage. The DNA in the Paisley Caves coprolites does not care that it was supposed to be too old. The volcanic ash at Rimrock Draw does not care that 18,000 years predates every migration model the textbook ever proposed. The footprints at White Sands do not care that children were not supposed to be walking in New Mexico lakeshore at the height of the last glacial maximum. And the mastodon bones in San Diego, spiral fractured and marrow extracted 130,700 years ago by hands we cannot name and a species we cannot identify, do not care about any of it. They are simply there, in the ground, waiting for the science to catch up to what they have been saying all along. Oregon started the conversation that made it impossible to look away. And somewhere out there, in dirt that no one has touched yet, the next piece is already waiting for the next person who digs deep enough to find it.